Hey there! If you love exploring Christian philosophy and theology, you're in the right place. The video's about to get started, but first, I want to ask you a question. Do you find the content I produce on this channel valuable? If so, here are some ways you can help promote it. The first is completely free. Give this video a like, comment, and subscribe to the channel. Second, consider doing a one-time donation, kind of like a tip. You can do this in the form of a super chat or super thanks below. Third, consider becoming a patron. Patrons get early access to videos, they get to be a part of a patron-only Facebook group we call TAC Academy, and patrons can participate in the book club that meets on Zoom once a month. The link to become a patron is in the description. Thanks to all my current patrons for your support. Enjoy the interview. Welcome to The Analytic Christian, the channel that helps you explore Christian philosophy and theology. Today I'm going to be joined by Dr. Adrain Moore, a professor of philosophy at Oxford University, to offer a critique of an animated video that Dr. William Lane Craig produced, where he offers some philosophical arguments in defense of premise 2 of the Kalam cosmological argument. So thank you very much for joining me, Dr. Moore.
Thank you for the invitation.
The way that I'm going to proceed, I'm going to play sections of the video and we'll pause and we'll let Dr. Moore comment on those clips. So let's go ahead and get started.
Did the universe have a beginning? Or has it existed from eternity past? If it did have a beginning, this raises a question. Did the universe have a creator? In part 1, we explored this question scientifically. Now let's look at it philosophically. Aristotle believed the universe was eternal in the past. But Al-Ghazali disagreed. He pointed out that if the universe did not have a beginning, then the number of past events in the history of the universe is infinite. But that's a problem, because the existence of an actually infinite number of past events leads to absurdity. It's metaphysically impossible. Why? The mathematician David Hilbert illustrates the problem by imagining a hotel with an infinite number of rooms, all of which are occupied. There's not a single vacancy. Every room in the infinite hotel is full. Now suppose a new guest shows up and asks for a room. The manager says, sure, no problem. Then moves the guest who was in room number 1 to room number 2, and the guest who was in room number 2 to room number 3, and so on to infinity. As a result of this shuffling, room number 1 becomes vacant, and the new guest happily checks in, even though all the rooms were already full, and nobody has checked out. And it gets even more absurd. Suppose an infinity of new guests show up at the front desk. No problem, says the manager. Then she moves each person into a room with a number twice that of his own room. So the person who was in room number 1 moves into room number 2. The person who was in 2 moves to 4. The person who was in 3 moves to 6, and so on. Since any number multiplied by 2 is always an even number, all the odd-numbered rooms become vacant, and the infinity of new guests gratefully check in. And yet, before they arrived, all the rooms were already full. It gets even crazier when the guests start to check out. Suppose all the guests in the odd-numbered rooms check out. In that case, an infinite number of people have left the hotel. And yet, there are no fewer people in the hotel. But suppose instead, all the guests in rooms numbered 4 and above check out. In that case, only 3 people are left, and yet exactly the same number of people left the hotel this time as when all the odd-numbered guests checked out. Thus, we have a contradiction. We subtract identical quantities from identical quantities and get different answers. These absurdities show that an actually infinite number of things cannot exist in the real world.
Tell me if I'm understanding the basic idea, and then I want you to comment on the clip. If the universe did not have a beginning, this would be the argument. If the universe did not have a beginning, then the past is an actual infinite. But the actual infinites lead to absurdity. That's what the video says. I don't know if leads to absurdity means actual infinites can't exist. Is that what leads to absurdity mean? I'm not quite sure. Maybe you can help me clarify, but So if the universe did not have a beginning, then the past is an actual infinite, but actual infinites lead to absurdities. So then the past isn't actually infinite. So the universe did have a beginning. Something like that. Does that sound right?
I think that's an excellent summary of the argument. And I also think that you have precisely put your finger on the crucial point, which is what is meant by leads to absurdity in this context. So let me begin by saying something that may sound a little bit surprising, which is the following. I think that overwhelmingly the most important single word in the clip that we just saw was the word metaphysically. And it occurred quite near the beginning of the clip. And we were told, I can't remember exactly what we were told, but we were told something like that the existence of an actual infinity of things, and in particular, the existence of an infinity of past events, is metaphysically impossible. That was the phrase that was used, metaphysically impossible. And it seems to me that everything hangs on what is meant by metaphysically impossible. And that in turn is basically the question that you were just asking. What is meant by the claim that these hypotheses lead to absurdity? And the reason that I'm emphasizing the importance of the word metaphysically in this context is that there are all sorts of different kinds of possibility. People talk about things being logically impossible, for example. So it's logically impossible for it to be raining and not raining at the same time in the same place. That's a violation of the laws of logic. People talk about certain things being physically impossible. It's physically impossible to travel faster than the speed of light. That would violate a law of nature, a law of physics. But that would be an example of something that was physically impossible, but logically possible. These different kinds of possibility don't align. There's no logical contradiction in the idea that something should travel faster than the speed of light. It's simply a fundamental law of nature that nothing can. So we have these various different kinds of possibility. And what William Lane Craig is encouraging us to think is that these various different scenarios involving the infinite, including Hilbert's infinite hotel, are metaphysically impossible. Now, I think by his own admission, there's no logical impossibility involved. I don't think that he thinks that we can somehow reduce these hypotheses to a logical contradiction. So it's not the most blatant kind of impossibility that's involved. On the other hand, we're surely not talking about physical impossibility either, if only because the laws of nature, presumably, are part of God's jurisdiction, and it's up to God what the laws of nature are like. And we don't want to suppose that God is in any sense constrained by physical laws. It's the other way around. Physical laws are part of God's creation. So we want to know what sort of intermediate impossibility Craig has in mind. And I just don't think that it's ever clarified. Now, for what it's worth, my own view is that there's some mileage for the idea that there's an intermediate kind of possibility at stake here. And I do actually have some sympathy for what Craig is arguing. I'm by no means somebody that wants to reject these views completely out of hand. But I do think that we need much, much more clarity about what's at stake. And the thing that worries me is that what we actually find are appeals to the counterintuitive nature of some of these results. So you find words like absurd or crazy being used. It's absurd that Hilbert's Hotel could have been completely full at one point in time, and at a later point in time it has vacancies, even though nobody has ever moved out. We're told that that's absurd. Well, in what sense is that absurd? It's not a logical contradiction. The mathematics makes perfectly good logical sense. And I don't think that Craig is interested in arguing otherwise. It had better not just be a matter of it being puzzling. I mean, all sorts of things are puzzling, and we just have to try to come to grips with the puzzle sometimes. And also, it had better not just be a matter of the infinite behaving in a different way from the finite. We all knew that there were differences between the infinite and the finite. I mean, Craig, I'm sure, would be the first to want to insist on that because of his theological views. The kind of thing that you get with Hilbert's Hotel certainly could not happen with a finite hotel. If a hotel had finitely many rooms and nobody moved out, then there'd be no, and was initially full, then there'd be no way that it could accommodate newcomers. That's a feature of how a finite hotel would behave, but why should an infinite hotel behave in the same way? So that's my basic worry about this argument, that we just haven't been told what it is exactly that we're being invited to conclude about these arguments. In what sense is the actual infinite impossible? And I fear that we just get a series of repeated claims to the effect that certain things are crazy or absurd. And it just won't wash, I'm afraid. I mean, all that we can say is that there are counterintuitive results here that show the infinite to be very different from the finite.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I will ask just a few kind of follow-ups for clarity.
Sure.
You made a distinction between logical impossibilities and physical impossibilities. How would you best characterize metaphysical impossibilities? You said that you think there can be some mileage there. How would you describe a metaphysical impossibility?
Good. I mean, so I think that is the $64,000 question. I mean, that's exactly what I'm asking Craig. I mean, I have views of my own. Philosophers these days talk a lot about metaphysical possibility and metaphysical impossibility. This is not Craig's invention. But I'm suspicious about whether these notions are made clear in the way that they should be. What we're supposed to think when people talk in these terms is that it's a kind of possibility that's intermediate between the other two. So if something is physically possible, then it's certainly going to be metaphysically possible, but perhaps not vice versa. And if something is metaphysically possible, it's going to be logically possible, but perhaps not vice versa. Now, of course, this cries out for some examples, and you can't really give examples with any confidence until you know what you're talking about. But the kind of thing that people have in mind would be this. I mean, if somebody wants to give an example of something that's metaphysically possible but not physically possible, they might, who knows, they might cite the example of water remaining a liquid at 0 degrees centigrade. Now, that's physically impossible. The laws of physics dictate that water will become a solid at that temperature, will freeze at that temperature. But so that's physically impossible, but it may be a metaphysical possibility. It may be that that's just the way the laws of nature are, and there's no reason, as far as the metaphysical structure of reality is concerned, why it shouldn't have been different. And then an example of something that might be logically possible but not metaphysically possible may be that water is composed of hydrogen and oxygen. And the idea is, well, now this is more than just a physical necessity. This has got something to do with what water is. It's not just a matter of how water behaves. It's the very intrinsic nature of water itself that's at stake. So that's why people will often want to say that this is an example of a metaphysical necessity. Water must, as a matter of metaphysical necessity, be H2O. Nothing else would be water. But again, it's not logically impossible. You're not violating the laws of logic if you entertain the possibility that water should have had some different constitution. For many hundreds of years, people had no idea that there was that relationship between water and hydrogen and oxygen. And yet they were still able to think logically about water. So it may be something of that kind that Craig has in mind, but it may not be. I mean, all we have is this appeal to metaphysical impossibility. He uses the phrase. And as I've said, these references to the absurd and the crazy, but it just requires clarification, I think.
Mm-hmm. Okay, a couple more follow-ups before we move on. Do you think that, I don't know that Craig would make this move. In fact, I think he probably wouldn't. Do you think that a move like this could be made? In his Hilbert's Hotel example, he talks about an actual infinite being subtracted from an actual infinite and leading to contradictory answers.
Yeah.
So could you cast this as a logically impossible, an actual infinite is actually logically impossible because you get a contradiction?
Good. I'm really glad that you asked that, because I was just thinking I should say something about the subtraction argument. So I think that's a very, very pertinent question. And I think it's a very pertinent question for precisely the reason that you give. I think it's an excellent question, because this is the one point in the discussion so far where it may look as if it's worse than the metaphysically impossible. It may look as if it's the logically impossible. Don't we have a contradiction here? So what Craig is in effect trying to do at this point is trying to do some transfinite arithmetic, which he himself thinks will lead to some preposterous result. And of course, that's part and parcel of his way of arguing that you can't do transfinite arithmetic, although people do. I mean, there's a whole branch of mathematics that's known as transfinite arithmetic. So what's going on here? Is there a logical contradiction? I think your question is an excellent one. I think it's just the right question. So let's just refresh our memories about how it works. Again, what we're invited to do is to imagine Hilbert's Hotel with its infinitely many rooms, all of which are occupied at a certain point in time. And then, first of all, we imagine that all the people in the odd-numbered rooms move out. I think. I mean, I may not remember the details exactly right, but I think that's how it went.
Yeah.
The idea is that there were infinitely many people in the hotel. Infinitely many people have left the hotel, but infinitely many remain, because all the people in the even-numbered rooms are still there. And so it looks as if infinity minus infinity equals infinity.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the first thought experiment. The second thought experiment again begins with Hilbert's hotel being fully occupied with infinitely many people in it. And this time everybody moves out except for the 3 people in rooms number 1, 2, and 3. So once again, you start off with infinitely many people in the hotel. You have infinitely many people leave the hotel, but this time only 3 remain. And again, I may not have remembered the details, but I
That
think
is right. Yeah.
good. So now it looks as if infinity minus infinity equals 3. But if infinity minus infinity equals infinity, and if infinity minus infinity equals 3, then it looks as if infinity is the same as 3, and that does look like a logical contradiction, not just a metaphysical contradiction. So what's the lesson that we have to learn from this? Well, the lesson that we have to learn from this is that if we are going to do transfinite arithmetic, we have to be extremely careful. And in particular, we must not presuppose that the same rules that apply to finite arithmetic carry over to transfinite arithmetic. That's one thing. But the other thing is, again, we have to be extremely clear about what we mean. In mathematics, just as in philosophy, you have to try to be as crystal clear at each stage in your argument as you possibly can be, and you have to define your terms rigorously. And in particular, if we're interested in subtracting numbers, we have to say what we mean by subtraction. Now, let's think about the finite case. If the question arises, what is 7 minus 5, for example? Okay, well, we can all answer that question. The answer is 2. But what were we asking? What was the question when we asked what is 7 minus 5? Well, we were looking for the number that you have to add to 5 to get 7. And the reason why 7 minus 5 is 2 is that 2 is the number that you have to add to 5 to get 7. And that works fine in the finite case. If you want to subtract one number from another, there always will be such a thing as the number that you have to add to the smaller to get the bigger. Now, let's imagine that we carry that over to the infinite case. We want to do subtractions involving infinite numbers. So the question arises, what is infinity minus infinity? And let's also suppose, for the sake of argument, that we've already explained clearly what we mean by addition. I mean, that's a significant assumption that I'm making, but the fact of the matter is that mathematicians working in this area do give a precise account of what they mean by addition. So now we want to start performing subtraction on infinite numbers. So in particular, in this example, the question arises, what is infinity minus infinity? What are we asking? We're asking for the number that you have to add to infinity to get infinity. Well, it's ill-defined. The question doesn't arise. There's no such thing as the number that you have to add to infinity to get infinity. You can add 2 infinities and still have infinity. You can add 3 to infinity and still have infinity. That doesn't involve any contradiction. There's no contradiction in the addition case. It's just another example of how the infinite is different from the finite. In the subtraction case, it looks as if you do get a contradiction, but that's just because it's not defined. Or at least it's not defined until somebody comes up with an explicit definition of it. But I take it that all that Craig is doing here is relying on some intuitive notion of what it is to subtract one number from another. And it's just not good enough. Mathematicians have to be much more precise and much more careful than that. So no, there is absolutely no logical contradiction involved here at all. And if there were, transfinite mathematicians would soon be out of a job.
Let me ask you this as one additional point of clarification, and then I promise we'll move on. I could continue to ask questions because this is actually really helpful for me. When Craig says in that video, an actual infinite minus an actual infinite equals an infinite, and then on the other hand, I think he has them side by side. On the other hand, you have an actual infinite minus an actual infinite equals 3. When you have the minus actual infinite, are those, when you define them, are those the same or not? From what you're saying, it sounds like they would not be the same.
That's not quite what I'm saying. I mean, if you would engaged in proper, serious transfinite mathematics in the way that many professional mathematicians are, you wouldn't just be talking about the infinite in this way. I mean, in fact, what you would do is what they do, which is you would introduce infinite numbers, and there are such things, and what's remarkable is that there are many such things. We have distinctions of size that we can draw between different infinite quantities. Now, none of that is coming into Craig's discussion at all. And by the way, that's not a criticism of Craig. That's just because that's a level of sophistication that's beyond this discussion. As far as this discussion is concerned, we could, if we wanted to make it precise, do so in terms of infinite numbers. And there is such a thing as the infinite number that's involved in this case, in the case of Hilbert's Hotel. And it's got a name, and the name that is given to it is Aleph 0. Aleph is the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet, and it's followed by a subscript 0, which registers that it's the smallest infinite number. Now, so we don't need to get hyper-technical at this point, but for what it's worth, if you're happy to accept my word for this, there is such a thing as this infinite number. It's the smallest infinite number, and it's the infinite number that would be involved in this case. And in fact, to go back to your question, all the infinites involved, both on the top line and on the bottom line, both on the left and on the right, all 4 of them would be Aleph 0. So on the left-hand side, you'd have Aleph 0 minus Aleph 0 equals Aleph 0. And on the right-hand side, you'd have Aleph 0 minus 3 equals Aleph 0.
Aleph 0 minus Aleph 0.
Minus Aleph 0 equals 3. I'm terribly sorry. Oh, yeah. Aleph 0 minus Aleph 0 equals 3. That's right. Yes. And so the answer to your question is no, that's not the issue. The infinities involved are all the same, and in these technical terms would be this particular number Aleph 0. My concern is with the minus. It's the minus sign that's the problem, not the infinities.
Okay.
And the objection is that subtraction just hasn't been properly defined.
I see. Okay. Yeah, that was really helpful. Thank you for doing that. Okay, well, in the interest of time, probably best to keep pressing forward. So let me move to this second argument that Dr. Craig gives.
Here is a second argument Ghazali offers against a past eternal universe. Suppose that for every 1 orbit Saturn completes around the Sun, Jupiter completes 2. The longer they orbit, the further Saturn falls behind. Now, what if these 2 planets have always been orbiting the Sun from eternity past? Which has completed the most orbits? Strangely enough, the number of their orbits is exactly the same, infinity. But that seems absurd, for the longer they orbit, the greater the difference becomes. If the universe has always existed, then an infinite series of past events has been formed by adding one event after another. It's like a sequence of dominoes, falling one after another until the last domino, today, is reached. The problem is that the final domino could never fall if an infinite number of dominoes had to fall first. So today could never be reached. But obviously, here we are. It's today. So the number of events leading up to today could not possibly be infinite.
Okay, so I might not have paused it in the best place. It seems like there's kind of two arguments there that are put right next to each other, and it was hard to draw the distinction between the two. But in the one case, you have this example of planets, how many orbits they're making. And in the other place, you have like an infinite series of dominoes leading up to the domino that is today, this domino falling. I guess the connection between the two is that it's an addition. Is it you're reaching an actual infinite through addition? Is that the idea that connects the two?
To be honest with you, I'm not sure that there is much of a connection.
Okay. We can keep them separate.
Yeah, and also, I wonder whether you're being over generous by describing the second as an argument. I mean, the truth of the matter is, I don't have a great deal to add to what I've already said, because I think just the same considerations apply here as applied to Hilbert's Hotel. Again, we find the word absurd being used, and again, we find references to what could possibly be, or what could have happened, how these dominoes could have fallen. And again, that screams out for clarification of what kind of could is involved. I mean, as far as the orbits of Jupiter and Saturn are concerned, it's very, very much like Hilbert's Hotel. It's just once again a reminder that infinite numbers don't behave in the same way as finite numbers. There's a sense in which what it shows is that Aleph Naught is the same as twice Aleph Naught. It looks as if Jupiter is orbiting the Sun twice as many times as Saturn, and yet if the number is Aleph Naught in each case, or infinite in each case, that seems to lead to the conclusion that Aleph Naught is the same as 2 times Aleph Naught. Well, again, you've got to tread very carefully, but the truth of the matter is that's exactly what mathematicians are prepared to say. Aleph Naught is 2 times Aleph Naught, and it's another illustration of the fact that infinite numbers don't behave in the same way as finite numbers. Whoever expected that they would? And it's not contradictory. It's not logically contradictory. It's perfectly respectable, perfectly coherent mathematics. If there's some kind of absurdity here, as before, we need to be told more about what kind of absurdity it is. And then I think the consideration of the dominoes is really nothing more than a bare assertion that we couldn't have reached today if an infinite number of days needed to have elapsed for us to get here. And that just begs the question. It's just straightforwardly question begging. Somebody who believes that the past is infinite will want to know why. And again, don't get me wrong, I'm sympathetic. I'm more sympathetic than these comments may suggest. It's just that I think a lot more needs to be said, and certainly a lot more than a simple appeal to absurdity or the very straightforward question begging that we have with the dominoes example.
Okay, I think how about this? I'll let the rest of the video play in case there's something that you want to comment on.
Sure.
And then we can wrap up.
Sure.
The infinite is nowhere to be found.
In reality, it neither exists in nature nor provides a legitimate basis for rational thought. The role that remains for the infinite to play
Is solely that of an idea. What objections might be raised to these arguments? Some people object that, unlike the rooms in Hilbert's hotel, the events of the past don't all exist at the same time. But we can easily tweak the story to get rid of this objection. Suppose the hotel has been under construction from eternity past, one room being added each year. How many rooms would there now be in the hotel? An actual infinite number. So if the past is infinite, that would imply that Hilbert's hotel could exist, which is absurd. Others have objected that an actually infinite number of things do exist, namely numbers and other mathematical entities. However, this objection presupposes that numbers really exist, but this is a highly disputed assumption that most philosophers reject. So if Ghazali's two arguments are right, then the universe is not eternal in the past. It must have a beginning.
Two objections were offered. Do you want to and there was a response to them. Do you want to comment on those objections and the response?
I think I am in danger of just repeating myself, actually, because one of the objections that they tried to rebut was in effect a reduction of this problem to Hilbert's Hotel again. I mean, there was a reference back to Hilbert's Hotel, and again, I'm sure you will have noticed the way that Hilbert's Hotel was dismissed. It was dismissed as absurd. So again, that takes us right back to what I've been pinpointing throughout this discussion, that we just need to be told more about what's meant by absurd. The idea that we have to acknowledge the existence of an actual infinity because, after all, there are infinitely many numbers, that is a new consideration. And I think that the video is quite right to suggest that that's a whole new issue in its own right. Whether we want to acknowledge the existence of numbers at all is a very, very deep problem in the philosophy of mathematics, and there's a huge amount that could be said about that. We could have an extensive and fascinating discussion on that issue. I think that's just in danger of taking us off onto a tangent. I'm not sure, by the way, that they are correct to say that most philosophers reject the existence of numbers. It's very controversial. Plenty of philosophers would be reluctant to talk about the existence of numbers, but plenty of philosophers would be only too happy to. And it certainly is true that if there are numbers, then presumably there are infinitely many of them, and that is a further reason to suppose that we do have to reckon with some sort of actual infinity.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I think there's just a few seconds of the video left where they talk about premise 2. So just to be fair, it's about 1 minute. I'll let this last minute play and then we'll wrap up.
Mm-hmm.
We know intuitively that whatever begins to exist requires a cause of its existence. Thus, we are led to conclude that the universe has a cause of its existence. So what caused the universe? Atheist Daniel Dennett says, the universe caused itself. But this is incoherent, because in order to cause itself to come into existence, the universe would have to exist before it existed. The cause of the universe must therefore be outside of the universe, spaceless, timeless, immaterial, and enormously powerful. Much like God.
So that part of the video tried to connect all the pieces of the argument together to see how this is an argument for God, where God enters this discussion. Do you want to comment on anything in that little clip?
Let me just say a little bit about that. I mean, our focus throughout this discussion has been on premise 2 of the argument, I think, hasn't it?
Right.
And right at the end of the clip, there's a reference back to premise 1. let me just say a couple of things about that. I won't go on at great length about it, but one of the people that was quoted right at the end there was Daniel Dennett, who encourages us to think of the universe as a cause of itself. And the counter argument was that this is incoherent. Again, the word incoherent, much like the word absurd, deserves some clarification, I think. But we were told that this was incoherent on the grounds that for something to cause itself, it would need to exist before itself. And that's a little bit puzzling in this context, because that looks like an argument that presupposes that a cause must be temporally prior to its effect. This idea that the cause must come before the effect. And it's puzzling that as there should be such an appeal in this context, because one assumes, in fact, I think he's explicit about this, that Craig's own view is that God is an atemporal cause of the universe, and that God's causation is outside time. So that there seems to be a little bit of internal tension there in what Craig himself is saying, or what principles he's relying on. But the only other thing that I would add, just because it's an echo of what I've been saying up until now, is that once again, it looks very much as if we're in the realms of questions about what's metaphysically possible or not. Do we want to insist that nothing can exist without a cause? It wouldn't be logically inconsistent to postulate something which was uncaused. It might be a physical impossibility. Is it a metaphysical impossibility? We're very much back at square one, I think. I mean, the question is, to a large extent, what the question is. That's to say, the issue is what the nature of these questions themselves really is. And once again, I just don't think it's been made sufficiently clear. And once again, I'm left wondering if there's not a little bit of internal tension in Craig's own position, because one assumes that a lot of these questions about what's metaphysically possible or not, theological questions as much as philosophical questions, would, by his own admission, I suspect, be beyond our comprehension. And yet here we are, supposedly trying to work our way through these issues. Who's to say that the whole thing is not a complete mystery to us, and that we don't have much insight into any of this at all? To be honest with you, that's one of my own fundamental reservations about the very project of trying to prove God's existence. I mean, that's one of the reasons that I find the whole Kalam cosmological argument suspicious from the outset. Mm-hmm. But that's a purely autobiographical observation. That's not an argument of any kind.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I'll try to finish up with just a couple of additional questions here. In that clip, premise one of the argument was brought up, whatever begins to exist has a cause. And there are Craig offers arguments for that premise. We didn't get to look at those. So I'm just going to, maybe that can be a different video. We're not even going to touch premise one. Mm-hmm. The question you raised about, well, Daniel Dennett's quote, the universe can cause itself or caused itself. And you said, does that assume that the cause has to be temporally prior? I would think Craig would say something like, it doesn't have to be temporally prior, but maybe it needs to be logically prior.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, my worry, just to clarify, my worry was that Craig's counter argument looked as if it presupposed that the cause has to be temporally prior to the effect. That was the way it was couched. The word before was used. Now, I'm sure you're right. I'm sure that there there's scope here for a charitable interpretation of that, where before doesn't mean literally temporally before, but may mean before in a more metaphysical sense. And in particular, perhaps there's a kind of logical priority that's at stake here. I think that may be right. So in which case my worry is, or my objection is, just an objection to how the counter argument has been presented and framed. And it's a serious objection, even if you're right, because it's another example of Craig just not making himself sufficiently clear. I mean, if it's not temporal priority that's at stake, then that needs to be spelt out. The sheer use of the word before suggests that we are talking about time. And if that's not what's intended, then explain that that's not what's intended and explain why that's not what's intended. So at the very least, there's a concern here about the clarity of Craig's objection and the clarity of how it's actually been stated.
I'll offer one bit of pushback on that, and I suspect you'll probably agree with this to an extent, but feel free to say, no, I stand by what I said. One of the costs in making a 5-minute pop level video like this for a lay audience is it's going to lack certain specificity because you're trying to make it very accessible, and it's hard to balance both of those. I suspect in Craig's writings, that's where I'm getting the idea. He does make the kind of distinction between a temporal priority and a logical priority. But when you're doing this with a lay audience, they're not going to catch that as quickly. So I guess I'll leave it at that. You can push back if you want.
No, actually, I'm not going to push back. In fact, I think I think that's perfectly reasonable. Actually, I think there is only so much that you can do in a 5-minute video of this kind, and I'm sure you're right. I mean, I'm sure if we push this particular issue with Craig, it would only be a question of time before he was clarifying things in that way. So you've been a little more generous and a little kinder to Craig than I've been, and quite rightly as far as that's concerned. I mean, I am being unfair in the context. As it happens, I don't believe that the same would apply to some of my earlier objections. I mean, of course, the same defense might be proffered. I mean, somebody might go back to the earlier parts of the video as well and say, well, it's exactly the same there. He's using expressions like metaphysically impossible, and he's using words like absurd and incoherent, because in the context, there's only so much that he can do. But if you were to sit down and thrash it out with him, it would only be a question of time before he was acknowledging the various mathematical distinctions and so on and so forth. And I don't think that is true. I mean, I obviously am open to rebuttal on this. Somebody may be aware of work by Craig that I'm not aware of. Craig himself may see this interview and may point me in the direction of work that I'm not aware of. And I have to keep an open mind. But what I've seen of Craig's work and some of the more popular presentations of this kind that are due to him suggests that my earlier criticisms of the earlier part of the video would still stand.
Okay, well, I'll end this video by asking you about, well, two things. One would be, ways of arguing for premise 2 that weren't mentioned in the video are maybe, do you think there's any promising philosophical arguments for the beginning of the universe that were not raised in the video?
Well, there may be compelling scientific arguments.
Right.
I mean, I'm out of my depth, I'm afraid, because I'm not a physicist. But you know, everybody's familiar with the idea of the Big Bang, and there's controversy about the origins of the universe, but there's something quite close to a consensus, I think, that our universe did originate with a Big Bang some 15,000 million years ago. And people believe that because they believe it on scientific grounds. There's empirical evidence for it. Now, no doubt there are philosophical considerations that kick in as well. And in particular, there's the whole question of whether supposing that the universe began with a Big Bang entails supposing that time itself began with the Big Bang, or whether it makes sense to talk about time before the Big Bang. To some extent, these are still empirical issues. To some extent, they're more conceptual, philosophical issues. We're in the kind of territory, I think, where the distinction between the empirical and the conceptual becomes very fuzzy, and the distinction between physics and the philosophy of physics becomes very fuzzy. But yes, there may be good scientific grounds for the belief that the universe is only finitely old. The very idea that there can't be an actual infinity, believe it or not, despite everything that I've said in this discussion, the very idea that there can't be an actual infinity is an idea that I'm sympathetic to. Despite everything that I've said. So my complaint has been a complaint to the effect that Craig is just going way too quickly, rather than a complaint about the conclusion that he arrives at. But yet again, it's very subtle, and we have to tread very carefully, because it's not obvious what the connection is between the actual infinite and an infinite past. And that was one of the issues that Craig addressed in the video, to be fair. And he suggested that an actual infinity would be a possible outcome of an infinite past, because after all, they might have spent all that time constructing Hilbert's Hotel. That was Craig's argument. And actually, there's some justice to that argument, but it's way. I just think it's way more complex than he's suggesting. And if you want to know what my own reasons are for being suspicious of an actual infinity, then the only response that I can give, the only response, and it's a very unhelpful response that I can give, is that I wish I knew what my reasons were as well. I mean, it is something that I would love to be much clearer about than I am.
So you don't have do you have like a paper or anything that you could direct my viewers to where you've tried to argue against an actual infinity?
Yeah, it's an entire book, I'm afraid.
Oh, okay, yeah.
I don't know whether that's good news or bad news. I mean, it's good news in the sense that I spend quite a bit of time trying to get to grips with the issue. It's bad news in as much as very few of the people that are watching this video may be inclined to plow all their way through the book. But I have got a book on these issues, and it's simply entitled The Infinite. And one of the things that I try to do in that book is to motivate the idea that there can't be an actual infinity. And in fact, it was a book that was reviewed by William Lane Craig quite favorably, because I think he thought of me as one of the few people that was on his side. So there are some ironies here.
Mm-hmm. Okay, one last question, and then I promise I'll let you go. I've really enjoyed getting to talk with you. Somebody like Alexander Proust doesn't argue against the possibility of actual infinities. He wants to restrict what can be infinite and what can't. So perhaps there can be some actual infinities. Mm-hmm. But what he wants to say is, in a causal kind of sequence, there can't be a causally infinite series. It's going to be causally finite. There's going to be a point. Do you think that that restricted type of in that restricted sense, that's enough to motivate premise 2 of the argument that the universe began to exist? You don't need this maybe more controversial claim that there can't be actual infinities at all.
It's not going to be enough to motivate premise 2 unless we also throw in some further assumptions about causation, I think, because one issue is whether there could be an infinitely old universe in which a whole lot of things were going on that were not caused. And we know that one of the fundamental principles that Craig is relying on is that everything that occurs does have a cause, but that's controversial. And if somebody saw no reason to accept that, that might give them scope that they wouldn't otherwise have to accept the existence of an infinitely old universe. So what it is it's a graphic reminder of how intertwined all of these issues are. It's very, very difficult to discuss any one of these questions without getting involved in a discussion of the others as well.
All right. Well, I'll end it there. Thank you so much, Dr. Moore, for taking the time to talk with me. I've really enjoyed it, and it's been helpful.
Sure, that's quite all right. And thank you very much, as I said at the beginning, for the invitation. It's been very enjoyable. Thanks.
So if you enjoyed this video, please consider watching the rest of the videos in this playlist, where we look at critiques, both positive and negative, of the other videos in Dr. Craig's animated series. I've interviewed people like Luke Barnes, James Franklin, and others. So thank you very much for watching, and keep exploring Christianity.